You know, I have always prided myself on being open-minded, someone who doesn't judge others based on their past. Life, after all, is filled with mistakes, missteps that people often make without fully understanding their consequences. I believed, quite firmly, that the past was like a distant shore, fading as you move forward. What happened before I came into someone's life, I used to think, was of no consequence to me. I could forgive almost anything. That's how I always saw it, until I was forced to confront the reality of my own wife's past, a past that ultimately shattered the foundations of my beliefs. When I married Sarah Dash, I believed I had found someone who, despite the scars of previous experiences, was ready to build a new life with me. Our wedding was simple, intimate, reflective of the quiet life we imagined we would share together. After the ceremony, I moved into her apartment, leaving behind my old place and renting it out, as a bit of extra income never hurt. We had been married for 3.5 years, and during that time, I saw only the best in her. In my eyes, she was loving, kind, and deeply committed to the new chapter of life we were writing together. She had been married twice before, and I had also been through a divorce, but that didn't trouble me. If anything, I thought it meant we had both learned from our past mistakes and could navigate the waters of marriage with wisdom gained from experience. My first marriage had ended quietly, with no dramatic conflicts or lasting bitterness. We simply grew apart. My ex-wife and I were two entirely different people, with different interests and views of the world. Our parting was mutual, amicable. She has since remarried, and by all accounts, she's happy. I'm glad for her. There was no unfinished business between us, no lingering pain. The storm that was to shake my life to its core started brewing about 6 months ago, at a time when everything seemed to be moving forward smoothly. My company had just undergone a significant transition in leadership. The previous owner had sold the business and moved abroad, and the new CEO, John Dash, wasted no time in making sweeping changes. He restructured the entire team, letting go of many longtime employees, but I was among the few who were retained. We quickly established a rapport, and he struck me as an ambitious, intelligent man, someone who valued hard work and loyalty above all else. He was only a few years older than me, and although he ran the business with an iron hand, we got along well. In the beginning, I was cautious around John Dash, wary of the corporate politics that often accompany such transitions. He tested my loyalty more than once, putting me in situations where I felt uncertain, even uncomfortable. At one point, I nearly handed in my resignation, but John was quick to intervene, explaining that in the cutthroat world of business, trust was the rarest commodity. He had been betrayed by colleagues, friends even, and he had learned to be careful. His experiences had hardened him, but in his own way, I think he respected me. He promised that if I stuck around, there could be greater things in store, possibly even a promotion to the role of his deputy. We maintained a professional relationship at work, always addressing each other formally in front of colleagues and clients. But after hours, John would sometimes invite me for a drink, a round of billiards, or bowling, moments where the weight of our professional roles could be set aside. During these times, he would open up a little about his personal life. He wasn't married, but he had a woman he saw from time to time. He lived with his sister, Emily Dash, and her son, a boy about 7 years old. The family seemed close-knit, but whenever I asked about his son's mother or the boy's past, John would become evasive, clearly indicating it was a subject he wasn't comfortable discussing. It wasn't until much later that I would begin to understand why. One evening, after several months of working closely together, John asked me a question that caught me off guard. He inquired about my personal life, remarking that despite our time spent together, I rarely mentioned my wife. It was true. I tended to keep work and home life separate. But in that moment, feeling at ease with him, I told him about Sarah Dash. I mentioned that we had been married for several years, though we didn't have children yet. John nodded thoughtfully, and then, out of the blue, asked to see a picture of her. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos until I found one of Sarah from our last vacation. I handed it to him, thinking nothing of it. But as soon as he saw her face, John froze. The color drained from his face, and his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His hands trembled slightly as he handed the phone back to me without a word. His eyes were hard, almost cold, as he muttered something about needing to get back to work. The rest of the day passed in an unbearable tension. He didn't speak to me unless it was strictly business, and even then, his words were curt, clipped. I was left wondering what on earth had just happened, but I didn't dare ask. For the next 2 days, the atmosphere remained icy, until finally, John called me into his office. He apologized, saying he had been under a lot of stress. He then invited me to his son's upcoming birthday party as a way to make amends. It was then that I asked if I could bring Sarah along. I thought it would be a nice opportunity for us all to get to know each other better outside of work. But the moment I mentioned her name, John went rigid again. His response was immediate and firm. No, I pressed him, trying to understand what had provoked such a strong reaction. He dodged the question, telling me only that it was a personal matter and that Sarah would never be welcome in his home. His words were laced with an anger I couldn't fully comprehend. John, I finally said, "What is it about my wife that has upset you so much?" His face darkened. "Not here, not now, he said quietly. "But if you want to know the truth, come to the party. I'll explain everything then. Just promise me one thing. Don't confront Sarah about this until you've heard me out, The weight of his words settled heavily on me, and I agreed, though my mind was already racing. What could John possibly know about Sarah that I didn't? What dark secret had he uncovered? And why had she hidden it from me? The days leading up to the party were agonizing. I went home each night, looking at Sarah wondering who she really was. Could it be possible that the woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was hiding something so terrible? Despite the ease that had developed between us outside of the office, my boss, John remained unyieldingly professional when it came to work. Our friendship never granted me any special treatment, nor did it exempt me from his exacting standards. He was strict with everyone, myself included, and he expected nothing less than full professionalism at all times. In the office, in front of our colleagues, partners, and clients, we were formal, addressing each other by title. Familiarity had no place within those walls. Yet, behind closed doors, when it was just the two of us, things were different. Over a cup of coffee, or occasionally a glass of whiskey, the tension would ease, and we'd speak to each other as John, and not as Mr. Smith and Mr. Brown. Outside of work, John enjoyed his leisure time. He had a particular fondness for billiards and bowling, often inviting me along as his playing partner. I accepted the invitations, partly to maintain our camaraderie, partly because I genuinely enjoyed his company. We might not have had the same life experiences, but we shared a mutual respect that grew over time. Yet, even as our friendship deepened, there was always an unspoken boundary between us, one that I knew better than to cross. At home, however, I seldom spoke about work. Sarah didn't seem particularly interested in the details of my job anyway. Her focus was elsewhere, on material things, on attention, and on the comfort that came with financial security. I had noticed this about her early on, but I told myself it didn't matter. We each had our roles to play, and as long as I could provide, I wasn't bothered by her lack of curiosity about my career. In contrast, John wasn't married. He wasn't the type to be tied down by the commitments of family life, though he did have a woman he saw occasionally. What was more surprising to me was that he lived with his sister, Emily who was also single and raising her 7-year-old son. The arrangement struck me as unusual, but I never pressed him about it. There was something about the subject of the boy's mother, John's ex-wife, that seemed to put him on edge. Whenever I brought it up, he would swiftly change the topic, making it clear that whatever had happened between them, it was a painful chapter he had no desire to revisit. One evening, John caught me off guard with a question. He asked why I never shared much about my personal life. His curiosity seemed genuine, though I suspected he already knew more than he was letting on. After all, before I was kept on after the company's restructuring, his new head of security had surely conducted a thorough background check. When I pointed this out to him, John chuckled, admitting that while he knew all the necessary work-related details, my personal life had never been his concern. Still, He was aware of my marriage. Why don't you have children yet? He asked, his voice casual but probing. I shrugged, offering the simplest explanation. It just hasn't happened yet. That seemed to satisfy him, at least for the moment. But then, as if continuing some train of thought, he asked to see a picture of my wife. It was an innocent enough request, and I saw no reason to refuse. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through a few photos before handing it to him. There was Sarah smiling in a picture we had taken during a recent vacation. I remember watching John as he looked at the photo, expecting some kind of casual compliment or offhand remark. But what happened next was far from what I could have anticipated. The moment his eyes landed on the image, something in John changed. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His hands trembled as he held the phone. His face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought he might drop it. His usually composed, confident expression dissolved into something raw, something I had never seen in him before. Without warning, he shoved the phone back into my hands, his voice a sharp bark as he ordered me to get back to work. I was stunned, frozen in place as the weight of his reaction lingered in the air. The man who had always prided himself on his control, who had never let emotion or personal matters interfere with business, had just unraveled before my eyes. And it had all started with a simple photo of my wife. For the rest of the day, John kept his distance. His usual warmth was replaced by a cold, almost hostile silence. Whenever he spoke to me, it was with a clipped tone, and any semblance of our friendship seemed to evaporate. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. What could have triggered such a strong reaction? What did John know, or think he knew, about Sarah that I didn't? The incident replayed in my mind over and over, each time leaving me with more questions than answers. Something was terribly wrong, but I had no idea what it was. All I knew was that whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning of something far more complicated than I could have imagined. For the next 2 days, a heavy silence settled between John and me. Our exchanges, once friendly and casual, were reduced to the cold, mechanical nature of work-related discussions. No more jokes, no easy camaraderie, just the rigid formality that had once defined our professional relationship. The tension gnawed at me, the question of John's strange reaction lingering like an unsolved mystery. I couldn't shake the memory of his face when he'd seen Sarah's picture, the shock, the fury, and the way he had abruptly dismissed me afterward. Then, on the 3rd day, he called me into his office. His tone was softer now, his expression apologetic as he offered a quiet, "Sorry, mate." He explained that he'd been under immense pressure, both at work and in his personal life, and that his behavior had nothing to do with me. "It's been a rough patch," he said, waving off the incident as if trying to bury it. But even then, I could sense something still simmering beneath the surface. As if to mend things between us, he extended an invitation. "My son's birthday is coming up," he said. "You should come. It'll be a small gathering, just family and close friends." The offer seemed genuine, a chance to smooth over the awkwardness. But when I asked if Sarah could join me, his response was immediate and sharp. "No, he said, the word cutting through the air with unmistakable finality. "She won't be welcome in my house." I was stunned. I had been trying, in vain, to piece together what had disturbed him so deeply about the photo. Yet here he was, not even attempting to conceal his disdain. "John, I said carefully, I need to know why. What did that picture stir up in you?" His reply came as cold as before. "Go to work, Steve. Just go to work, But before I could press him further, he added something else, something that left me both puzzled and uneasy. "To make sure you don't feel out of place at the party," he said with a strange, almost forced smile, "I can arrange for my sister, or even an escort, to keep you company." He paused, perhaps sensing my rising confusion and frustration. "Steve, he said, his voice lowering as if in concession, "you'll know everything soon enough. Just not now. Not here. And trust me, you're not going to like it, That was it, the cryptic promise of revelation left hanging between us. He swore that at the party, he'd show me something that words alone couldn't explain. Until then, he made me swear not to mention any of this to Sarah Dash. I was left with no choice but to agree, though the days that followed were nothing short of unbearable. I wanted, more than anything, to confront Sarah Dash, to demand an explanation for whatever John knew and I didn't. But I had given my word, and though it weighed heavily on me, I kept it. In those agonizing days, I feigned normalcy at home, pretending that nothing was wrong. It was excruciating to look at her, to sit across from her at dinner, all the while knowing that a storm was brewing, one I wasn't sure either of us could withstand. Finally, the day of the party arrived. Emily Dash, John's sister, was the one who picked me up from work. She was pleasant, kind even, and we made polite small talk during the drive. We stopped by a supermarket to pick up a last-minute gift for John's son, and I couldn't help but wonder how much Emily knew, or if she sensed the tension between John and me. But she gave no indication, her demeanor cheerful and unaffected. The party itself was lovely. John had gone all out, ensuring the food and atmosphere were perfect. His son was all smiles, and I found myself relaxing, if only a little. Emily sat beside me throughout the evening, making sure I was comfortable, engaging me in conversation when the room's buzz seemed to grow too loud. Yet all the while, I kept looking for an opportunity to pull John aside, to demand the truth he had promised me. He, however, was evasive, skillfully dodging my attempts to talk privately. Each time I approached him, he'd smile and say, "Later, Steve, after dinner." And so, I waited. Finally, once the meal had been cleared away and the guests were starting to settle into the post-dinner lull, John motioned for me to follow him. We walked to his office, and to my surprise, Emily came along. I felt a knot form in my stomach as John unlocked a safe and withdrew a folder. There was an ominous weight to the moment, the air thick with unspoken tension. John placed the folder on his desk and took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto mine. "This, Dash," he said, gesturing to the folder. "This is what you need to see, Dash." Sarah was John's ex-wife. The revelation hit me like a tidal wave, each word deepening the sense of betrayal that had begun to gnaw at my core. The boy, John's son, was their child, the product of a marriage that had ended in the most acrimonious way possible. Yet, to the boy, his mother was dead, or so John had told him. "Better a dead mother than a cruel one," John said, his voice heavy with the bitterness of old wounds. The air in the room seemed to tighten as he handed me a stack of papers, his expression grim but resolute. There it was, their divorce papers, stark and official, accompanied by a faded photograph of the three of them. Sarah looked younger, smiling for the camera with a child cradled in her arms, the boy barely a year old. John Dash, standing beside her, had the strained, weary look of a man already bearing too many burdens. He had been a different person then, owning a small store, working hard to build a life for his family. But that life had been ripped apart in a series of catastrophic events that would reshape his future. And in the middle of it all was Sarah Dash, who I had thought I knew so well. John began to tell his story. His business had started to suffer when a supplier, a man he had trusted, swindled him, taking all the money he had invested. The timing couldn't have been worse, with the economy in turmoil and banks refusing to extend him loans. Desperate, he turned to private lenders, men who operated on the fringes of legality, charging interest so exorbitant it bordered on extortion. When John could no longer pay the inflated rates, the threats came, first in the form of phone calls, and then something far worse. "They cornered me in a parking lot," John said, his voice tight as if reliving the moment. "Beat me so bad I couldn't walk for months. 6 months bedridden, and then another year in a wheelchair. I lost everything." His words were raw, filled with the anguish of a man who had been brought to his knees not only by fate, but by the cruelty of those he thought he could trust. And Sarah Dash? She didn't stay. Instead of standing by him through that darkest period, when John was at his most vulnerable, she had an affair. She left him, walking away from the shattered remains of their life together, abandoning not just John Dash, but their young son as well. Her lover didn't want to raise someone else's child, John said bitterly. He told her they could have their own, and that was all it took. She filed for divorce. She didn't want to be tied to a loser. The word loser hung in the air, bitterly spat, a scar he had carried long after the papers were signed. In the divorce settlement, John had made one thing clear. If she wanted to leave, she had to relinquish her parental rights. He refused to let Sarah simply walk away without consequences. He demanded she give up all claims to their son, or else he would demand child support. Faced with the ultimatum, Sarah chose the easier route. She signed away her rights, effectively abandoning her child, and John showed me the copy of the papers as proof, the ink long dry on her signature. But that was not the end of it. After Sarah left, the threats began again, this time targeting Emily Dash, John's sister. The lenders, knowing John was weakened, threatened to take the boy if they didn't get their money. In a desperate bid to save themselves and protect the child, John and Emily were forced to sell everything they had. The store was gone, their parents' house sold, even their car, all sacrificed to pay off the debts that had nearly destroyed them. Emily worked every day, without a break. John said, glancing toward his sister as she sat quietly beside him, her face a mask of calm that belied the years of struggle she had endured. Somehow, we managed to pull through. We paid off the debts. I had surgery, complicated, painful, and we rebuilt our lives from nothing. We did it for him, for the boy. And through all of this, years of hardship, of starting over, Sarah had remained absent. She had never once asked about their son, never reached out to see how John had fared after she abandoned him. It was as if they had ceased to exist in her world, as if the life they had shared had been nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. John's voice was heavy with resentment as he finished his story, but there was something else there too, something more profound than anger. It was the weight of having survived. She made her choice, he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of sorrow and defiance. And now you know. That night, I drank heavily, draining a significant portion of John's liquor supply as I tried to wrap my mind around the devastating truth. Never in my darkest imaginings could I have foreseen this. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with was nothing less than a monster. To abandon her husband at his most vulnerable, crippled and defeated, and worse yet, to turn her back on her own child, her flesh and blood, was something beyond comprehension. It wasn't just a moral failing. It was a complete annihilation of any sense of decency. By the next morning, I was resolute. The haze of alcohol hadn't softened the blow. If anything, it had hardened my resolve. I told John that I needed to return home and pack my things because there was no way I could continue living under the same roof as Sarah Dash. Not after knowing what I knew. My apartment was still rented out, so I had no immediate place to go. And though I considered staying in a hotel, John offered me a room at his place. Emily was supportive of the idea, her quiet but fierce loyalty shining through. Eventually, I agreed, but only on the condition that John accompany me to my apartment. I didn't want to face Sarah alone. At first, John hesitated, but I insisted. I needed him there, not just as moral support, but as a witness to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Emily Dash, however, refused to come. She knew her temper too well, and she admitted that if she saw Sarah Dash, she wouldn't be able to control herself. I believed her. The anger simmering beneath her calm exterior was palpable, and I appreciated her honesty. When we finally arrived at the apartment, I entered first. Sarah was immediately on the offensive, launching into a tirade about how I hadn't answered her calls, how she'd been up all night worrying. The irony of her concern was almost laughable, given what I had just learned about her. But the moment John stepped into the room behind me, the air shifted. She froze, her face draining of color. It was as if she had seen a ghost, and in a way, she had. "Hello, dear wife," Dash, John said, his voice dripping with sarcastic malice. I stood there, looking at this woman I had once called my wife, and all I could think to ask was, "How have you been able to sleep at night all these years?" I wasted no time after that. I packed the essentials, my laptop, some clothes, the bare minimum I would need to get through the next few days. Meanwhile, Sarah began to unravel. Her voice escalated into a panicked scream as she hurled accusations at John Dash, claiming that he had manipulated me, that I was just a pawn in his game of revenge. She insisted that he had forced her to give up their son, that she had been cruel in the past, but she had changed. She pleaded with me, saying she missed her son and that she loved me, but I couldn't bear to listen to any more of her lies. The woman standing before me wasn't capable of love. She was only capable of deceit and selfishness. And whatever remorse she claimed to feel, it was too late, far too late for redemption. Before we left, John turned to her one last time, his voice cold as ice. "If you try to come near my son, I'll destroy you." Dash, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of fear, and she swore she would stay away. The venom in John's words left no room for negotiation, and I knew she believed him. We left the apartment that day, and I haven't seen Sarah since. The divorce proceedings are well underway, and my lawyer assures me that it will all be finalized soon. I'm still living at John's place for the time being, though I've already found a new apartment where I'll be moving shortly. It's a strange, bittersweet feeling, starting over after the life I thought I had crumbled in front of me. In hindsight, it's hard to fathom how blind I had been to the truth about Sarah Dash. I had loved her, planned to spend my life with her, and she had kept a past so dark, so unforgivable, hidden from me all along. But I've learned something through this ordeal. People don't always change. Some betrayals run too deep, and the scars they leave are impossible to heal. I don't regret walking away. I only regret that it took me so long to see the truth.